Now, this empirical confirmation that we are indeed mimetic creatures finds support in a long genealogy of thinkers that have been central to Homo mimeticus. We started this project mentioning Plato and Aristotle, who argued that humans are mimetic animals. But in the 19th century, founding figures of what I call mimetic studies, like Friedrich Nietzsche or Pierre Janet or Georges Bataille, among others, were very sensitive to the fact that humans respond at the embodied level to the perception of facial expressions and emotions, and that an immediate understanding would emerge at the sight of facial expressions or gestures that didn't require the mediation or a theory of mind. I'm therefore particularly delighted in establishing new genealogical connections between the contemporary discovery of mirror neurons and this long tradition in mimetic studies that was already sensitive to the mirroring properties of Homo mimeticus. So you were talking before about the fact that some figures are somehow obscured and then maybe reappear later on.
Yeah.
You mentioned the theory of Einfühlung. And I was wondering, for me, psychoanalysis seemed to have cast a bit of a shadow on these theories of what I call the mimetic unconscious, an unconscious that allows people to resonate in everyday intersubjective reactions. Nietzsche was an avid reader of literature on hypnosis and suggestion.
In your book, you discussed the unconscious tradition of thought on the unconscious preceding Freud. Yeah.
And so is this tradition, I'm thinking of figures like Pierre Janet or Charles Ferret, even more obscure, are these kind of figures that you find also helpful in addition to the phenomenological approach?
Yeah. The first attention directed to philosophical speculation in relation to mirror neurons was towards phenomenology. Many years ago, after Marc Jeanneret published a BBS paper on motor simulation, I think it was 2004, a French philosopher, Jean-Luc Petit, wrote a letter to us saying, "I'm flabbergasted, you should turn to Husserl, you should read the fifth meditation, Cartesian meditation." And we invited him, he gave a talk at our, back then it was the Institute of Physiology, and I was already familiar with the phenomenological tradition, particularly with the phenomenology of perception of Merleau-Ponty in relation to my research on the way we map space, you see? Very personal space. Space is not an ether in which all things float, practognosia. So I was already, in a way, attuned to phenomenology, but there was an incredible boost after the discovery of mirror neurons, because I started reading Husserl, Edith Stein, the second book of Ideas. Then I dug deeper into Merleau-Ponty. I even approached, although more shyly, Heidegger, Michel Henry. So many phenomenological thinkers, because I think, to me as a neuroscientist, I'm not a philosopher, of course, what is central of phenomenology is central also for where I think cognitive neuroscience should head to, which is the notion of experience. While still as we speak, most of our colleagues are totally focused on the relationship between the brain and the way we explain the world away, the way we cognize the world. Very few people are interested in the notion of experience, while experience is, of course, central for phenomenology. More recently, I found very interesting also to have a dialogue with American pragmatism, particularly with John Dewey in relation to aesthetics. Art as Experience, I think, is a book that tells a lot. Although it was written almost 100 years ago, I think it's still very, very useful to understand how we appreciate art, our relationship with cultural artifacts. I would say that phenomenology on the one hand and pragmatism as we speak are two important aspects of philosophy which I'm finding highly relevant for my work as a cognitive social neuroscientist.
And in this dialogue, I think, with what I started calling mimetic studies, I think we could add this tradition of hypnosis, which has been forgotten, but I'm having here a quote from Charles Ferré, who was a physiologist working under Charcot, and he says in a book titled Movement and Sensation, which already kind of points to the phenomenon, it is possible that certain subjects who are particularly sensitive to the phenomenon of induction imitate unconsciously the movement that necessarily accompanied the idea of the one in his presence, and will consequently be led to feel the same emotion, the same thought, in a word, to obey what we call mental suggestion. I think this tradition of suggestion comes many times very close to Thierry's mirror neuron.
Indeed.
What I wanted to come to, and I'm thinking of these kind of figures that are in line, in a way, in the humanities with the tradition of embodied simulation. One of them is René Girard, who has been receiving quite a lot of attention, especially in literary studies, and in many ways the theory of homo mimeticus that I want to propose provides an alternative or a supplement to Girard's theory that tends to be focused on mimetic desire and on violence primarily. And you've written about Girard in a text on two sides of imitation.
Right. I had the opportunity and the privilege to become acquainted personally with René Girard, who organized a seminar which lasted 3 years, if I remember correctly. We had 2 years in Stanford 4 years. 2 years in Stanford, 1 year in the Austrian Alps, in the final conference where he couldn't attend because he was already ill in Paris. And in this multidisciplinary workshop seminar on mimesis, there were people from many different traditions. Notably, one key protagonist beside Girard himself was Andy Meltzoff, who discovered neonatal imitation. And so I found Girard thought fascinating, thought-provoking, particularly if you think where he moved from. He moved from literary criticism. He was a comparatist. He started discussing Shakespeare, the double in Dostoevsky, and to build around this literary core a more omnicomprehensive theory of mankind, building upon anthropology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, history, and the like. So, a kind of man of the Renaissance, a polymath in a way. But at the same time, the more I delved into his writing, the more I became acquainted with his thought, with his ideas, with his model, the more I realized that his idea about mimesis was, in my opinion, and you agree with that, actually you build a well-developed criticism, to one-sided. So the mimetic rivalry, which stems from mimetic desire, lead to violence, which in turn produces the phenomenon of scapegoating upon which rights and religions are built, which is a possible way to go. But I think reading your last book, Homo Mimeticus, you speak a lot about the likely shamanic origin of Paleolithic art. You speak about Chauvet, Lascaux. In our book, The Empathic Screen, together with Miguel Eguera, we do the same. We start with a film of Herzog. Mimesis leads to creativity, leads to social practices, leads to the creation of cultural artifacts, which are a trademark of our species. So I'm totally with you when you pinpoint the one-sided theory of mimesis put forward by Girard. I basically agree with you on that.
It's good to hear, and indeed, instead of focusing on mimetic desire, I prefer to speak of a mimetic pathos that can be both good and bad depending on particular context. There was a phrase in that chapter that caught my attention, where you say that prior to any triangular mimetic relationship, the main object of infant mimesis is the affective behavior of the other.
Yes.
Yes. And I was wondering, because this triangular structure is a very powerful structure that is there in Girard, is also there in Freud.
Yeah.
It's an Oedipal structure.
No, not coincidentally, in one of his books, he writes that the thinker that came closest to the theory of mimetic desire with the original herd is the Freud of totem and taboo. So the Oedipal origin of his theory, as you pinpoint in your book, is very clear. Exactly. I think that one of the more neglected aspects that make we sapiens who we are is our neotenic nature. Namely, we are born immature. If you consider that our brain at birth is a few hundred grams and it reaches the completion of its maturation at the end of adolescence, and in adulthood, the final weight is 1,400, 1,300 grams. I don't want to reduce human culture to the weight of the brain, but since I think the brain is necessary, although not sufficient, to understand who we are, that tells you a lot. The vast part of the development and maturation of this crucial part of our body happens after birth. But happening after birth, it means that it happens within a network of social relations. So, in order to become who we are, we need the other. So the notion of the self is a contrastive notion. There is no self without the other, and vice versa. And I think that the beginning of everything predates the moment of our birth, but starts already in the womb. And the first relation we experience is with our mother, within whose body we grow and develop. This becomes even more evident if we enjoy the company of someone else in the womb, as in the case of twins. And we published, with the colleague Umberto Castiello, more than 10 years ago, a study that, not coincidentally, we entitled Wired to be Social, where we were able to show that the kinematics of the arm movements of the twins were quantitatively different from the kinematic of the movement that were self-directed or the exploratory movement where the member of the couple explore the inner walls of the womb. The kinematic features of the movements when they were targeting the other member of the couple had features that, transposed to adulthood, suggested those were the mostly carefully controlled movement. So as to say that when I move my arm toward another human being like me, I need more control with respect to when I touch my body or when I touch an external object, like the inner wall of the womb. And immediately after birth, we are wired to imitate the adult peer that we immediately encounter, that most of the time, if we are lucky enough, is the face of our mother. And it is not coincidental that some of the most vocal opposer of mirror neurons, like, for example, the cognitive psychologist Celia Hayes, who tried to reduce the impact and the heuristic value of mirror neurons by equating the mechanism of mirroring as one of the many associative mechanisms that we can find in our brain. And not coincidentally, in talks, she introduces mirror neurons by showing one of Pavlov's salivating dogs. She has a big problem with neonatal imitation because since there are no mirrors in the womb, this seems to suggest that there is a primitive, a rudimentary form of mirroring which is innate, which, in being innate, defies the idea that all mirroring is one of the many associated mechanisms. And she published a paper where she denies the existence of neonatal imitation, which instead is a very solid and empirically documented phenomenon, not only in humans, but also in non-human primates. It has been shown in chimpanzees, even in macaque monkeys. A colleague of mine, Pierfrancesco Ferrari, was able to demonstrate not only that neonate macaque monkey exhibit neonatal imitation, but also that when they do so, you see a desynchronization of the motor part of their brain, very similar to the desynchronization that we spot in human adults' brain when witnessing the action of others. So mimesis is one of the key ingredients, and it is not coincidental that mimesis is developed to the most extreme level in us, in just humans. We are the true mimetic species. Although we say to ape, in Italian we say scimmiottare, apes and monkeys are very poor imitators in comparison with human beings. Most likely, one possible answer to this discrepancy consists in the fact that mirroring the resonating palette, so to speak, if you pass me the metaphor, in our brain is much wider than in the case of non-human primates. In monkeys, as far as we understand, mirroring occurs mostly, if not exclusively, for goal-related motor action, while in the case of the human brain, mirroring also applies to apparently gratuitous movements like raising your arm, jumping, raising your finger. And to the extent that in order to imitate what others are doing, you need to copy not only the goal, but also the means required to accomplish that very same goal or final outcome. In order to do so, you need a mechanism that is able to replicate not just the goal, but also the movement. And this apparently is particularly present in the human brain and not so much in the brain of non-human primates.
It's very useful that you go back to the ontogenetic development of the child, methods of experiments.
Present
early on.
On the one hand, the standard cognitive take on what makes us different from other primates or from other mammals is the fact that we have language. Okay, and this led some scholars even to imagine, dream of a sort of deus ex machina biological occurrence, phenomenon like a genetic mutation. Steven Pinker even defined the FOXP2 gene as the gene of syntax. I think we should bring in the psychoanalyst to explain why we need to sanitize the body and explain who we are exclusively in logocentric terms. I think language, of course, is an ineludible part of who we are. You can't get away from language because we grow into language, and language in a way affects deeply all the embodied mechanisms that led us to language. But both from an ontogenetic and from a phylogenetic point of view, you can have cognition without language, and language is an expression, an exaptation of mechanisms that are not, strictly speaking, linguistic. You say that in your book, when you say it's a long story that begins with Homo ergaster, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, where most likely language as we think about it was not in place. But these hominin were able to build tools. So they had a social structure. They most likely were imitating others. There were cultural practices that were passed from generation to generation.
Do you think that mirror neuron played a role in the development of language?
I think so.
Yeah?
I think so. And one part of my research and of the research of other colleagues of mine specifically deals with the relationship between the body and language. For example, with George Lakoff, years ago, we put forward the idea that concepts can be embodied. Paper title was The Brain Concepts. And as we speak, we are investigating an apparently very abstract aspect of language, of human language, which is negation, a logical operator that apparently has nothing to do with the body. We are exploring the possible relationship between linguistic negation and motor inhibition. So this tells you how closely related I think is embodiment mirroring, embodied simulation, and language.
Indeed, you mentioned before to bring in the psychologist, and I have here a quote before Meltzer of Pierre Janet, who said, well, psychologists focus too much on the individual, they should focus more on relation. And the quote says, he speaks about the mother, that's why I was thinking about it, the newborn relationship to the mother, and he says, the two personalities, the one of the child and the one of the mother, emerge together in a confused manner. Here we come to what may seem to be a paradoxical idea, namely that a distinction between persons, between myself and the socius, he calls this other that is indistinguishable to the self as socius, is not a fundamental and primitive as thought it was, and that there was a period in which there are still traces where my person and my acts were confused with the person and the acts of others, specifically the mother, but any caregiver.
Yeah.
Does that find support in contemporary?
Of course. And one thing that influenced me a lot and that pointed me towards developmental psychology and infant research was Daniel Stern. Mm-hmm. Daniel Stern and his book that he published, I think, in 1985, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, together with the work of other psychologists like Ed Tronick, for example, or Colwyn Trevarthen, are fundamental to understand what being human really means. And the title in itself betrays the crucial importance of relations in developing our own personal identity, which is not a given. There's no box in the brain where the self sits. The self, if you ask me what the self is about, in the first place, I see the self as a dynamic process. A dynamic process of constant molding and remodeling through the variety of social relations we entertain with others. I have no doubt about it. It's one of the few things I have no doubt about.
Good to know, because that's also one of the hypotheses of Medicus, that intersubjectivity is constitutive, that there is an ontological openness, as you also emphasize, and I think it's there in the figures like Girard, it's there in phenomenological tradition, and it's there in thinkers of the body. That's why I really appreciate your focus on intercorporeity foundation.
Think about the experiment of Ed Tronick about the still face. So, if you take a video footage of a couple, a neonate and her mother, who are cheerfully playing, exchanging vocalization, making smile and gestures, then all of a sudden the mother is instructed to stop moving, to freeze, keep an mimic facial expression, and you see that at first the neonate is very surprised of this sudden change in the behavior of the mother, and the neonate tries with all her means to re-engage the mother into the dialogue, and when he or she realizes that all these attempts do not produce any result, start displaying a stressful reaction, starts crying, and many mothers are incapable to remain still for 3 minutes, as required by the experimental protocol. So this tells you how naturally attuned to the other we are from very early on. And as Max Scheler wrote, also the way we read our own emotion greatly benefits from the relation we have to other individuals. We literally learn to understand our inner state by interfacing with the other.
Absolutely.